I'm going to hand it over now to Matt Hussein. And if you have questions, go ahead and ask them, and then we'll interrupt him when we can and ask him for you guys. Okay? All right. Matt, are you there? Hello?
He's there. He's laughing at you right now. See, he's looking at you and he's laughing.
But I can't hear him.
I know. He looks like some kind of evil mastermind with a goatee.
Yes, we will send the shirt to Canada if you win.
No, seriously, we can't hear you, Matt.
Uh-oh. Well, so
okay.
How do you feel about presenting Matt's slides?
Not a problem. All right, everybody, welcome to our webcast. My name is John Stratt. That's right. So the goal of this was to kind of have a tool review for 2017 of some of our favorite tools, and I guess we can do that until Matt gets his microphone going. And I'll start it off while we're waiting for Matt to get his microphone working again. So my favorite set of tools is pretty much anything at all that has anything to do with the MITRE attack framework. The Atomic Red Teamer tool set from Red Canary, and I know that Casey Smith has been working on that. And I also believe that Red Canary just released a tool that automates the process of actually checking and running those commands, because the Atomic Red Team was just a collection of scripts, but now I think that they have a tool that actually fires all of those different things. If you haven't checked out the MITRE attack framework, do so. If you haven't checked out the Atomic Red Team framework on Git as part of Red Canary, I think it's probably the single most important set of things that have been released for defenders and attackers this year. So I'll pass it off to...
I heard Matt.
Matt, are you back?
I should be back. Do I sound okay?
Fantastic.
Oh, awesome.
All right, so if we have time at the end, well, the rest of you, Joff, Bo, and Mike, and I think Kent, and Rick, who's right next to me, but oddly enough, it's weird. At any rate. So we'll kick it off to you, and I think that this is actually a pretty important webcast, because we have a lot of customers when we do something with Burp, they're like, so I have to go spend money to replicate that action or replicate that request, and the goal of this webcast is to show you how you can leverage and get a tremendous amount of value out of ZAP attack proxy from OWASP as well. So Matt, I'm kicking it over to you, sir.
Absolutely. Good to be vocally present this time around. Hopefully we maintain that status quo, at least for the rest of the webcast. So this webcast is actually, I put some slides together, but essentially it's the whole BHS team with communication that we've had with our partners and such who've had this exact same kind of issue. And it's really for two specific sets of groups. And whether you're a pen tester yourself, or if you're on the opposite side of the house, and you may be required to replicate the findings that a pen tester may have saddled you with, and if they're doing that with tools that you don't have the ability to do, it makes your life a lot more difficult. And on the opposite side of the house, as pen testers, if we're trying to actually make impactful security changes and at least raise the bar each time we go around and do a pen test and make folks more secure, we kind of have to navigate part of that path as well and be prepared to bring them to water and help everyone drink at least a little bit. And that's a problem we've had at BHS kind of repeatedly, where we use Burp Proxy for most of our testing on web applications, but then we have to translate it into some kind of injection string in the scripting console in the browser, or figure out exactly how to use ZAP because we used it a while back, but a little bit less intuitive if you're not used to it than Burp might be, or the opposite way around as well, depending on which types of techniques you may be using. So the goal of this is specifically to bridge the two. No brand new, crazy, hardcore, elite skills, but I think both sides of the house need to be able to play together, and to be able to translate that, I hope that this set of slides functions as something of a Rosetta Stone there. So before we jump into that trailhead, we're going to do some strategy and some tactics. The tactics, we're going to actually go in and we'll use Burp Suite and ZAP to perform those kinds of attacks against web applications. But first, before we jump into that, to make sure everyone's on the same page, we'll talk a little bit about web application attacks, some intercepting proxies, what they exactly do for us to enable us to perform those kinds of attacks, and then ZAP and Burp, a quick tour of those before jumping into performing different types of attacks with each. I see John making weird statements. Have I lost audio again?
No, you're fine. I'm going through an external set of scans and things, and I'm finding oddness. That's all. So if you see me look really frustrated, it's basically like, why the hell are you running a service from 2007 angry? So go ahead, continue.
So if I start looking over to my left really crazily, it's because John's gesticulating, and I think it's about me. Let's see. So web application attacks. Oftentimes you think you got an attacker, you got a web application, he sends bad stuff, injection strings, and things happen. But let's split that apart just a little bit so that you can see where the attacks actually land. So if you send something into a web server, you might be trying to cause an effect on that web server, but you may just as well be trying to attack the user in their browser context or have something land on the back-end database. So things like command injection or code injection attacking the web server directly, database SQL injection, having the web server attack its database, which may be resident on the same host, or on a separate application or system, and then having the database or the web server or the website in general attacking the user through their browser. Something like cross-site scripting, see a lot of JavaScript attacks resident there.
And just as a point of reference, this is actually something that's really critical, what Matt's talking about. If you can go back to that slide. We're actually in the process of trying to interview a couple of people for some positions at BHIS, and one of the questions that we ask is, and this is something that Egypt came up with, and I think it's a good question, whenever you open up a connection to a web server, what happens? And being able to identify things like load balancers, identifying databases, identifying different proxy technologies that might be in play is essential anytime you are testing. So you got to think, what's between me and the ultimate destination that I'm trying to get to?
Absolutely. All right, so intercepting proxies. What we're trying to do with an intercepting proxy is have complete control of all of the traffic that we send to a website, that we receive back, and be able to manipulate that such that we can bypass things like client-side controls or otherwise interact with the system beneath the hood in a way that the website or browser by themselves may not directly allow us to. For example, a little screenshot here in the bottom right-hand corner where it says enter your zip code. A standard way to implement that field in a website is a text type field with a max length of 5, because you got 5 digits in a zip code. You may even specify them to digits directly. You might have filtering enabled on that. That goes beyond HTML, the input field's length, and into, say, something like JavaScript. What you do see a fair amount of, though, is that that type of filtering is where the security controls are enabled. If we want to test those or break those, an intercepting proxy is a great tool to enable that for us. So here's ZAP and Burp. ZAP is the one on the left-hand side of your screens, and Burp is the one on the right. As you can see, they're kind of similar. They're both Java-based applications. Burp is a commercial tool, whereas the ZAttack proxy, ZAP, is by OWASP. It was originally the Peros proxy, but then was rebranded as ZAP, and a lot of work's been done and put into it to make it what is, I would say, qualitatively just a very powerful open source standard proxy. Before ZAP came along, I was doing a lot of work with WebScarab, but ZAP kind of integrates all of that with fewer bugs and a little bit more speed, which is very nice. You see that ZAttack proxy ZAP's very well regarded by both people who play around with web applications, look for potential attacks in them, who go after things like the Facebook code bounties and others. But Burp is, generally speaking, the tool that's most widely known in the information security community on the commercial side to perform these same kinds of attacks. But both are just as capable of performing these attacks as the other. They're just a little bit more different from each other. All right. So before we actually jump into actually using one of those proxies, you have to configure your browser to be able to use them. Now do note, if you install both Burp on your system as well as ZAP, by default they both use port 8080 as their local proxy port, so they will fight with each other. You can go into the settings to change that port and use them both next to each other, side saddle, which is what we did when we were creating this presentation. However, that creates lots of Java running on your system at the same time, which may or may not be advised. So when we configure Firefox, first we need to go into the settings and tell Firefox how to connect to the internet. We set up a manual proxy configuration and set that port up there as well. Depending on whether you're using HTTPS or SOCKS proxy in line with those two things may determine a little bit more of your configuration, but just basics for what we're doing here, standard HTTP proxy will work just fine. So this is ZAP. One of the things that's most confusing about ZAP for people who've had a lot of experience with Burp Suite is its abstraction, if you will, of the request and response in the main view. Burp does this as well, but not directly, and we'll see that here in just a moment. So here you've got the request. When you send something through the browser, you just browse to a website. ZAP will display the request that was sent. If you click on the response, then you see the pane that's listed off to the right-hand side there. You get the code that comes back in from the website. So just request and response, general communication with the web server on the remote end. Now, when we want ZAP to actually intercept one of those communications, one of those packets, so we can modify the request, we can turn on the break functionality or breakpoint in ZAP. So you see there circled in that big red circle, there's also a red dot on the inside. It's green by default. When you click on that, it turns it red, and that tells ZAP that you're ready to start intercepting requests. Next time you refresh the browser or browse to a different page on the website, before the browser actually makes it there, it hits the web proxy, and the web proxy allows you to change any of the fields you see available to you. So here, that middle screenshot's there, what you would see when a breakpoint's been set and you've refreshed something or browsed something with the browser, where it says there modified request. I've just typed that directly in. You can click there and your mouse cursor goes, and it's just like a text editor. You can change any field there that you would like to. Now then, to move between the break and on to the next step, we have to either step through the request or hit the play button to tell it just to continue to send requests after that. So there's two buttons there that are right next to that big red breakpoint dot. One is a bar and then a play button, and the other one's just a straight play button. The bar and play button means, and that's the one that's highlighted in the screenshot below, means step through. So it means submit this request, move on to the next one, but then trap that one each time. So it breaks on each request as you go through. If you just hit the play button, let's say for instance in this case we wanted to modify the cookie that was being set by the browser, and we were happy with it afterwards, every other request that gets sent back and forth, be they the hundreds or multitudinous number of ads that might be on a website or not, we don't care about breaking or stopping between each one of those. So then hit the play button if that's your use case. This is pretty handy, specifically because most websites on average have between 12 or more additional cross-origin requests per page load, and hitting play or step over and over and over again does get a bit aggravating after a while. So step versus play here.
Hey Matt, I got a question real quick, and now I apologize if I'm preempting you, but the question is this: there's a lot of emerging technologies in the web right now, things that are much more HTTP 2.0 oriented, things that are using WebSockets, things that are using much more RESTful APIs instead of the traditional sort of push, and traditional sort of get and post type of transactions. In traditional HTTP 1.1. So how is the proxy landscape evolving to sort of keep up with these newer protocols that are emerging?
I'm not sure, and I'm sure that you guys can all jump in here and help me out with this one, but I'm not sure that I've seen a huge amount of evolution in the proxy landscape. That might just be how I've been using proxies. When it comes to Web 2.0 and a lot of these JavaScript one-page sites, React, Angular, I code in them, so I generally just open up the console, the scripting console in a browser, and I use things like the React tools that you can use, that you can install as in like a plugin, a browser plugin, or a Chrome extension. I use those to pull apart the applications.
I think you just hit upon it. I think that was a bit of a trick question, so sorry, Matt. But what we find ourselves doing as testers is moving towards the client side more and more in terms of the developer consoles and plugins. As these newer protocols basically are starting to prevent us from being able to have as much traction in terms of the attack surface. That's kind of my sense of it anyway.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Every React, just an example, or Angular application that I've tested, I've literally pulled down React tools and I've broken them apart in browser scripting console or something like that. I do have to say, browser scripting consoles are an absolute godsend to web application pen testing. There's a fair amount of this, say, leading a horse to water that we're doing here with ZAP that you could do directly from the scripting console. Say if we produce an injection string that's in JavaScript, and then just have them open that and paste it in. Oftentimes, that's enough. And yeah, scripting consoles are awesome.
Good deal. I'll let you keep going.
All right. Moving on to Burp Suite then. So Burp Suite Pro, this is what the interface generally looks like. As you can tell here, there's a lot more stuff going on, but you see here essentially the same fields that we saw just a moment ago in ZAP. So just to put them back into context here, go back to ZAP, and then here with ZAP, you can see the intercepted request field, the context window for the site, the request history down at the bottom. Now going into Burp, we see the same fields essentially. The response is there. We see the request history, that's just on the top now. The context window is on the left side. And then we see these issues tabs and issues details on the far right-hand side. We'll see how to pull those up here in ZAP in just a moment. But they're also displayed on the main page, the main view in Burp Suite. I think one of the major misconceptions about ZAP is that it doesn't have the same active scanning ability or the same issues details or information about them. That doesn't help you pull those apart quite as much as Burp does. And while that might be true in depth, I don't think it's true, at least in the existence thereof. And we'll see that here in ZAP once we move into active scanning and those kind of things. ZAP does absolutely have those definitions built in. They're just not front and center the moment you open it. All right, so jumping into a little more with Burp Suite. With Burp Suite, when we turn on interception, we normally go into the proxy view, and you can turn interception on here. So proxy, intercept, and you turn it on or off to intercept requests from the browser. When it's off, the browser can browse the websites just fine with nothing standing in the middle of it. When you turn interception on, then Burp will automatically intercept the request, and as you can see there on the right-hand side, that image is of Burp intercepting a request from the browser to a sessions.html page. And we'll see a little bit more about that page here in just a little bit. And so here, we've moved from the proxy intercept tab to the proxy and then HTTP history tab. Well, you do get a lot of the same information under intercept as well. With Burp, they break out the context substantially more. Now, what is of note here, specifically interesting when you're trying to compare and contrast ZAP and Burp directly to each other, that HTTP history tab, we see there the request and the response are abstracted from each other in separate tabs. That's because when we have a lot of requests that have just gone through Burp at any point in time, if we want to go back in and view them, we can within HTTP history here within Burp, which is really handy, but it also just so happens to work the same way that ZAP does, where ZAP will normally show you the request, and then you click response to show the response data. So if you're trying to get someone who's using ZAP to see the same information-ish as they would normally be displayed in Burp, as you might be seeing as a tester in Burp, this HTTP history tab is pretty handy because it looks a lot more similar to the way ZAP normally runs as opposed to the front page of Burp where there's a lot more going on and it looks just a bit different. Okay.
Hey, Matt.
Yeah, Sierra.
There's a question from Jason. He says, is there any value in proxying requests in a chain, ZAP to Burp or vice versa, to streamline discovery of low-hanging fruit?
Potentially. It's actually something that I do fairly frequently. I don't normally chain ZAP to Burp because they're both systems with fairly similar functions, and I think that they do accomplish both hats pretty similarly with some benefits on either side, which we'll split apart here in a moment. But I do think that proxying things like SQL map or Nicto through Burp is really handy, and the same goes for ZAP. Specifically, if we go back to this HTTP proxy field here, or HTTP history field here, excuse me, if you send out like a SQL map, I may have just dropped the connection. Am I still there? Can you all hear me?
Yes.
You're still here.
Okay. I haven't quite lost it yet. If you send something like a SQL map out or a Nicto scan, when those scanners have finished, you don't necessarily have, at least not by default, a really quick and easy available log of all the requests in the history of what they've sent. Whereas if you tell them to each use, and they both do have this ability built in, a HTTP proxy and set that proxy to Burp or to ZAP, you now have that same history context menu that you normally would use for intercepting proxy available to you in all of your tools. With Nikto or SQL Map, I like to do that and then look for HTTP 200s for successful requests to see what kind of information may have come back. I've actually stumbled across some pretty interesting stuff doing that.
And hey Matt, one other thing that I would add to that too, whenever you start proxying other tools, you can add like custom headers to things. Like let's say the tool doesn't support adding a custom header, that might be a nice benefit to adding to all your requests.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons why you might want to add custom headers is especially if there's an IDS or some other system and you want to identify very quickly after the fact what's good traffic, what's bad traffic. Set the evil bit.
Or if you want to test struts.
Test struts.
Yeah.
No, he went full evil bit. I like that. That's good.
Yeah, he said evil bit. Yay!
Well, and plus there's some scanners out there, like I think Skipfish for a while had a passive ability, and there's proxies out there that can do passive analysis just whenever data is being transferred through and possibly find some vulnerabilities. But you can go a little too crazy. I know I talked to one tester who had like 4 or 5 different proxies he'd like to chain through, and I think that that's just getting to the point where you're obsessive compulsive.
Yeah, and it's also really easy to get overwhelmed by the data. So this HTTP proxy history field again, normally when I'm running, say, SQL Map or Nikto through it, I will save those out afterwards as a separate burp file so that I don't have all that crazy amounts of data interfering with the actual testing that I'm doing hands-on and unique injection strings and such, just because those are probably chasing down some kind of idea that I may have about the vulnerability that I'm trying to trigger. Whereas Nikto is just bam, and it's all out there. Same with SQL Map. Not that there's anything bad about that. It's just to have those separate things, separate, helps me stay on track with whatever it is that I'm testing. At least I found. All right, jumping into some specific attacks. So client-side control is an example. We're going to keep most of the web code very simple here, but talk about the kind of implementations that may exist around it. So for instance, client-side controls here. The simplest one to implement is an HTML control where the thing that lets you type stuff in only lets you type in 5 characters. You might see these in some password fields. For instance, if you, and for those of you USAA members out there, the USAA bank limits your password length to 12 characters. So when you start typing your password in the password field there, after you hit 12 characters, you can't type your password any further. They also truncate your password right there as well. So if you had a longer password, I'm sorry, you actually don't have a longer password. You just think you do. And they develop controls like this for any number of business reasons. In the case of USA specifically, they before they had put restrictions on the length and then started just arbitrarily truncating people's passwords, the length thereof, the problem they had was a lot of phone calls. People would call in and say, I forgot my password because I created this 32-character long beast of a thing with complexity, and it's super awesome. If only I could remember it. Okay, well then they reset your password and you on with your day. But when this happens a lot, this starts to engender a bit of a business cost. And so to reduce that business cost, to reduce the user overhead, they started truncating passwords, and then now they've moved on to actually preventing you from setting passwords longer than 12 characters. So there's a number of reasons why client-side controls like this might exist. They might exist simply to prevent users from creating an additional level of complexity, as in that case. They may also exist as a control. Let's say that this zip code field where it says enter your zip code, you hit submit. 99508 is an Alaska zip code, incidentally. Let's say that field responds back to you with the zip code 99508 is in Alaska, or is Anchorage, Alaska, something like that. You see this often in search fields. In those cases, you've got reflected input back at you. If the input's filtered, that might be okay. But if the input's not filtered, and we type some kind of injection string in there as opposed to just a zip code, we might be able to get cross-site scripting, or if it goes to the host to execute something before it returns data, we might be able to get code injection or command injection or any other number of types of vulnerabilities or exploits. In the case of a client-side control like this, the developer might think, well, sure, this could go bad, but there's no way that somebody's going to be able to maliciously use this in 5 characters or less. And while that may or may not be true, it's certainly true that we can bypass the client-side control directly, and an intercepting proxy makes this extremely easy for us to do. So as you can see in the top right and the bottom right-hand side of the screen, There's the burp mechanism to do this, as well as the ZAP method to perform the same exact thing. So in burp, were we to say intercept on, and this here under proxy, and then intercept, then it gives us the raw output, which we can edit directly if we'd like to, or parameters. If we click parameters, it gives us a table, and that table shows us, okay, the URL field that's being submitted is zip. That's the name of the HTML field, the input field. And that would be that input type there with a maximum length of 5. When it intercepts that request, what you'd see is 99508. Were we to double-click on that, we can then type in any information we want and hit forward, and Burp will send that off to the remote end for us, injection string-wise. Below that, we also see additional parameters that we could modify. We'll do these in just a little bit, where we can set different things in the cookie, as well as whatever else is sent across in the request. Now, in ZAP, most folks think that the text field is the only option. So in Burp here, we're under the Parameters tab. Where you go to the Raw tab, you would see the request information directly, much like we saw here in this field here. So in the bottom right-hand corner, you see Request and then Raw. We could also edit this directly there and then hit Forward if we were under the Raw tab. But if it's just something simple, we may prefer to do it with a table, just because the table is very straightforward. We can see it right there. Especially handy for our users who may or may not be quite as who may or may not have discovered the injection by themselves. The more we can help them there, the better. So if they're using something like ZAP and they see just that text field, be aware there is actually a table mode in ZAP as well. So if you just hit the drop down there and go to table, you'll see the exact same thing as you do in Burp, and you can edit it similarly as well. Okay. Questions before I move on, Sierra? Client side? Okay.
Wait.
Yes, we do have a couple questions. So Blessin says, how do you do authenticated scan in Burp and ZAP? Did we answer that yet?
I think you touched on it briefly, but okay. Yeah, you can. Go ahead.
Yep, very briefly. So were this website with the zip code thing that we're scanning authenticated, we may already be authenticated to the website. For example, take a look at that cookie field where it says UID 0 and handle neo. Handle in this case represents something like a username field, and the cookie may also have a session ID. We're going to take advantage of bad session management, which is why you don't see a session ID field here, because this is bad session management as opposed to good session management. So we'll do that in a moment. But the session might be managed by any number of things. In this case, it's just managed by an existing, relevant, verified username. It's called, in this case, handle, neo, and a UID. You'll often see these things implemented as PHP session ID or JSession ID in more robust web applications. That's what's used to track the authenticated state. So if we set that on our requests, essentially we're authenticated when we make the follow-on request. If we would like to do that directly without having to set the cookie by default, if we intercept the request, as we did, then the browser, if the browser is already authenticated, say the browser was logged in, it's going to set the cookie across in the request that we just intercepted, which is exactly what we see here. So in this case, the user is already authenticated as UID 0 with their handle of neo, so this request would be authenticated. If we didn't have one to mock up, you can create one and then just add fields as well by adding on to the table that you see over there.
And we have another question from Derek. Does Burp ZAP require an additional plugin to modify the length control if it's set by script? Otherwise, could you use dev tools?
The length control if it's set by script. I'm not quite sure I follow.
Okay, Derek, if you want to elucidate.
Can I see it? See the question?
Yeah.
Does ZAP require...
Oh, here. So the length is set to 5. Could you modify that with dev tools?
Yes. So that's actually a really good idea. In fact, that's the way that I generally prefer to do these. So here's an example. Let's go to that website and just do it.
Uh-oh, here comes the demo.
Oh, snap.
Yeah.
Live demo.
Live demo. How could this possibly go wrong?
Live demo. Guaranteed way to make things interesting.
Jeff, where'd your video go? Someone wanted to know if you got blown away by your speakers.
I did. I got
He's still there, it's the
blasted to the wall. I had to peel myself off the wall and come
Oh.
back. No, just kidding. No, I had to scratch my nose, and I preferred that everybody didn't see that.
Well, now you tell this, so it's kind of the same thing.
Oh, man. All right. See, that was a good little interlude while Matt is setting up his live demo.
There we go.
Here's another question for Blessed. Maybe someone else can answer this while we get this demo up and going. How will you do authenticated scan in Burp and ZAP? They want a live demo too.
Just the cookie.
I thought
Whatever
we all-
manages the session state, just make sure that that's in the response that's being sent back and forth, and you are authenticated. So if you need to be authenticated, log in with your browser. That'll
Pretty
create
much
the-
that easy.
And sometimes the cookies will expire, so you can set macros to check for whether the session is actually valid at the current moment you're sending that scan. And then if it's not, go ahead and perform the macro to log in, get that cookie, and then set it on the scan.
Yeah, I think what you're hearing from a lot of people is it kind of depends on the context. We've even had applications whereby client-side authentication with certificates is required, and it becomes significantly more complex in that situation where you actually have to program Burp to present the client-side certificate. And so there's a lot of nuance to your question, and it's hard to specifically answer just sort of a generic how do we perform authenticated scan, I think.
I tend to just disable the interceptor, log in manually, and then replay a previous request, because then the headers will always be there.
David has another comment on that. What about SSL sessions like Fiddler? Can you proxy secure sessions?
So you can proxy secure sessions. Burp by default does TLS man in the middle. When it does, Burp has its own certifying authority certificate built into the proxy that you then have to import into your browser, because Burp will present a certificate to you, and Burp will act like the client to the TLS server on the other end. So it definitely will man in the middle things. Now, sometimes that can be tricky in situations whereby certificate pinning is implemented, for example, where you have binary comparisons of certificate content. We can get some failure situations there.
But if you actually import that Burp certificate, or if you actually intercept with Fiddler itself on the host operating system itself, because the operating system has to be proxy aware, whenever you have HTTPS applications going outbound, you can actually just put the certificate in there. So usually whenever you're using Fiddler, what you would do is not replace it with Burp, but what you do is set up Fiddler to actually do the intercept on the Windows operating system, and then forward it on to Burp and let Burp handle it from that point on. That's usually what I've done with HTTPS-enabled applications that are not browser-based.
There's been some good comments with some links to some tutorials and stuff that I've replied to in the chat, so if you can you can look at those for more information.
Very cool. All right, Matt, are we ready?
Absolutely. So by bypassing a client-side control, especially one this simple, you can just edit the HTML, and your inspect element, your browser console, will let you do that directly. In this case, the Firefox, you right-click on the website, allegedly, come back. Oh, I back-arrowed. Right-click on the website. It'll let you inspect element. Sorry, I've got to zoom it running, so it's doing some weird clicking stuff. So it'll let you inspect the element, and when you inspect the element, the code comes up down here. Oh, come on, Firefox. There we go. And then here under the form, we just extend that to find where it actually says max length, and we can just edit this. If we want 500, 5,000, 50,000, done. And that's all it takes. If you want something a little bit different, you could save. So if you right-click, click Save As the HTML, and then just edit the fields that you want, open it up in your browser. Most of the time, all of the links, in this case you can see here it says webcast, zip code, HTML for one of the links. Most of the other links, things like your JavaScript, your CDNs, they're all the things on the actual internet. So even if you save as on your local system and then edit the HTML, most of the things that really matter will still open up not broken. And the Air Force Academy's grading system used to be susceptible to this attack. You could change your user context and become whoever you wanted to on their grading application.
Used to be. Used to be.
Yep.
Not
That was
anymore.
my, first responsible disclosure, actually.
There you go.
So I
and
just
the one that
a general
replaced it with
comment.
was worse.
So Matt is also pointing out, I think here, that the developer console in browsers such as Firefox are incredibly useful, and it also applies to the question that I was asking earlier, which is when you're in a situation where you've got a very JavaScript-heavy framework, such as React or Angular, the developer console becomes really, a big key in being able to test appropriate things in your app.
Yep. And to follow the JavaScript chain, if the actual client-side control is implemented in JavaScript, as in no white space or whatever, and JavaScript strips the white space, you can just go in here and you can delete the function that does that. And that works too. Or you can go to the JavaScript console here and you can type in arbitrary JavaScripts. In this case, if I were to do a document.cookie, it'll actually, nope, that's not a cookie. It'll display the current cookie for the website. So in this case, there aren't any cookies. If you go to a website where there are, then there would be. Oops. This one, for instance, does use cookies. The user field here is set based on what the cookie is set to. You can edit the cookies too directly from the JavaScript console. We'll see that here in ZAP and Burp, just because we're doing intercepting proxies. But you can absolutely make these changes in your JavaScript console too. Something like document.cookie equals what was it, handle equals
Hey Matt, are we getting screenshots from version 2.7 of ZAP?
Of ZAP? It's the latest version, so that's the newest little icon there.
Okay.
It is updated as of today, so whatever the latest version is that updates today, that's what it is.
Okay. Cool.
So I mean, I wonder how, setting a cookie with handle equals John Strand, I mean, that could go terribly wrong.
Well, the JavaScript's okay here. Oops.
The JavaScript's fine.
Yeah, as long as it doesn't link into a Google image search request, I think we're okay.
Although he's kind of plowed over other John Strand to that John Strand.
Kind of ruined his career.
Yeah, a little bit.
Ruined his street cred, John. He cannot even make
Sorry.
a livelihood anymore.
No,
But,
it's just
but we digress.
We digress. All right.
Of course we did.
That specific technique is extremely useful for any kind of attack, be it an injection attack, a reflected attack, something like reflected JavaScript, cross-site scripting. I've even gotten command execution off of bypassing client-side controls in a web application where the web application wasn't supposed to allow you to change a certain field, but it did allow you to change all the other fields in the table. So by simply looking at the name of the form field for that one, which you weren't allowed to edit, and then sending a request, so in this case we just add another item here to that table with the name of that field, and sending that, I was able to change the command string and get code execution, command execution specifically, on a web application with just bypassing client-side controls. So this does happen, and it happens really badly when it does. Active scanning. This is one, I think, of the major misconceptions about ZAP. Folks tend to think that ZAP doesn't have the same capability when it comes to active scanning as Burp does. This tends to revolve around either active scanning or the Burp Intruder, both of which ZAP can do. They're just a touch different. So in this case, we've got a website with maybe a lot of fields, and we may or may not have the time to go through and enumerate each and every one of these fields. Oh, and there you go with the version of ZAP. It is 2.7.0. If that answers that question. So you may not have the opportunity to enumerate each and every one of these fields on your own, or at least by hand, manually, just time constraints, scoping, whatever it might be. Active scan can come in and help out quite a bit there. I would not take it over an actual tester's ability to, interact with each one of these fields, because active scanning, especially in web applications where there's so much custom code going on, you don't tend to get a huge amount of success. But when it works like a champ. And ZAP and Burp both have active scan modules built in. So this case with ZAP, you go to Tools and then Active Scan, or you can just hit Control-Alt-A when you've got a site selected in your context pane. So here we see kinazoa.com, that site's selected, and then you go to Tools, Active Scan to start up that scan. Brings you to the Active Scan context window where you can say what the starting point is for the scan. You can narrow down your scope. It's very important to do that when doing active scans, just because you don't want to accidentally send all kinds of injection attacks against everything that's linked into the website, like Google Analytics, like JavaScript, jQuery, and so on and so forth. So controlling that and paring that down is also quite important. And then here under Active Scan, you can see a list of all the different scanned requests that have been made by the Active Scanner. And at the very bottom, you see the alert window. Now, this alert context window, I think, is also quite important, specifically in ZAP, because in Burp, they take all the issues and the alerts, and they put that front and center in every type of plugin or module or tool that you use. I mean, it's on the front page, in fact, all the issues, activity, and then the issue details. In ZAP, they're a little bit more hidden. So here we run Active Scan, we see the Alert tab. It's in the very bottom pane in ZAP. If we go to that, we can go through all of the alerts or issues that may have been found on the web page. So in this case, there's X-frame options and cross-domain JavaScript source file inclusion, and that pane on the right-hand side talks a little bit about the issue and what might be the reasons for it. Very handy when it comes to identifying false positives. Yeah, Sierra.
Oh, sorry. Arturus wants to know, can you modify or randomize the time of each scan request?
Oh, yeah, Burp can do that. Burp can do that. That's where it emulates manual testing.
Okay.
And it does it. Well, it's not randomizing from the perspective of like an IPS, but it'll go through and like make a random request and then wait a couple seconds and then try another one. So that way it makes it look like you're manually testing the website at night. So they'd be like, yeah, Matt was working all night last night. I mean, I saw requests on the web server until like 4 a.m. and then it just stopped. So yeah, it can do that.
Yeah, it's just, we invoke the plugin called Pen Tester is active and then just walk away.
Word. I'm not exactly
sure how
know
our secret.
Thing with ZAP, but it does allow you to set timeouts and wait time between each one of the requests. So I imagine there's something fairly similar you can do with ZAP. You can also create extensions and plugins for ZAP as well. It's got its whole own marketplace. So beyond what's built directly in, you may be able to find something specific like that out there. Okay, so same thing with Burp. Now with Burp, there's this whole scanning tab. So if you go to the scanning tab and under live scanning, you can then enable scanning according to your scope or use a custom scope right off the bat there. What this will do is it'll follow your browser around. So as you browse to the website, it'll make active scanning requests similar to the ones that your browser has just made. You can also just right-click on the actual host and then click actively scan it, and that will work a little bit more similarly to the way it's done in ZAP. So here in ZAP, you right-click on the host from the host context, click on Active Scan, or go to Tools and then Active Scan. Here with Burp, you right-click and then Active Scan is right there for you. Issue activity is under Scanner and then Issue activity. This is the same kind of information that you would see on the Burp homepage, the front page of Burp, if you will, and then also here under the Alerts tab in ZAP. They're both there, they're just in different places. So you have issue activity. The scan queues, which you see on the bottom there, is the tab right next to issue activity. That's Burp queuing up a bunch of different scans that it's about to perform before it does perform them for you. Okay. Different kind of attack, user enumeration. This is one we do quite often in BHAS. When you're on the outside, start reconnaissance, then move from reconnaissance to more active enumeration techniques. One of the first things you need before getting access to a domain or getting some pwnage is to get users. So Mail Sniper, great for that. You can also do it straight off of many different web applications. So here, you've got a web application. This is in fact a WordPress. This is my blog, and it works on my blog just fine. So here's a user field and a password field. You say, okay, I don't remember the username or the password, so you click on reset my password. Okay, then it takes you to another field that says, type in your username or emails for us to send you the email reset link. Kind of typical here. Here's where it gets, perhaps not atypical, just because this is a WordPress that it works on. So who knows? If you click Get New Password, it'll send you an email that gives you a reset link to reset your password. The problem is it also says error invalid username or email if it's not a real username or email. But, and I created a test account on my blog for this, with a test account, I type in test and say get new password, and it says sent you an email, check your email for confirmation link. So this means we have two different types of use cases versus whether the user exists versus whether the user does not exist. So for existing users or non-existing users, if we have their username, we can tell which one is valid versus which one is invalid. This means if we take a big list of all possible usernames and we guess all of them, we'll know exactly which ones have accounts on the site or not. That's user enumeration. Guessing each one at a time by hand kind of sucks. So let's not do that. And Burp Suite and ZAP have got your back when it comes to this. So here, the problem here is the password research function provides information about whether the username is real or false. And so we can use the fuzzer in, oh wow, that slide is totally flipped. So the top there, it says Burp Suite. That's actually ZAP. And the bottom, it says ZAP. It's actually Burp Suite. So just swap them.
We were testing the audience just to see if
Were
they're
you paying attention? Gotcha. So in ZAP, we can use the fuzzer in order to do many things that you can do with the Burp Intruder. Many people think that the Burp Intruder is just absolutely awesome, and it is. And then they take it one step further and say, well, ZAP has nothing equivalent. And that's just not true. The fuzzer in ZAP is a lot more simple to use, but requires you to do a little bit extra on the back end, but really can do a lot of the same kinds of things. So in this case, we're using the fuzzer in ZAP as well as the intruder in Burp in order to enumerate all of the user accounts on the system. Works a little bit like this. So here on the ZAP side, we say we browse with our browser to the login page. Nice. Then we try to log in. Test, login failed. Cool. That means here in our history, we've got at the very top of our history what a login request should look like. So you right-click on that, go to Attack, and then Fuzz in ZAP. That'll open it up in the fuzzer. And in the fuzzer, we can control and set different things to modify on that specifically. So the log field is the username field in WordPress. So we just change the log field to use something arbitrary from the fuzzer. So we go back to what the fuzzer looks like here in ZAP. That's the one at the very top. So the fuzzer locations allows you to add all kinds of different payloads that you may want to use for fuzzing the system. In this case, you probably just want to upload a username list, very much like a password list. And password guessing works the exact same way. Okay, so you upload that, and then now you can guess all of the usernames. In this case, for this test, I had it fuzz through numbers 0 through 1000 because that's easy. So you can see there in the bottom right-hand corner of the left-hand pane where it says log and then PWD. PWD is the password test. Log is the username, and right now that specific request is at username 82 out of the 0 through 1000 that I had it fuzz through. But instead of running from numbers 0 through 1000, all you have to do is give it a username list or username file, much like we would typically do in Burp, and it works the exact same way. In Burp, the intruder is actually substantially more complex to use than the fuzzer in ZAP. It just is also, I think, more intuitive at the same time. So here's what that looks like. In Burp, you do the exact same thing. Take your browser, log straight into the website, and login failed. Okay, now we have a request. Right-click on that one and send it to the intruder. So you can see that in the right-hand side. We're sending it to intruder there. It sends it to the intruder, and intruder we can set these little squiggly curly things around fields that we want to modify. And so if you just double-click on the field that's there, add those little curly brackets in, and then go to the Payloads tab, you can then set up whatever the payload is that you want it to. In this case, I just used a brute forcing payload that goes through letters A through Z all the way one character through, or maybe it was just 4 straight. I forgot. But it was just a standard one in this case as well. Normally for both of these, instead of using some kind of fuzzer or number counter, you would just give it a list of usernames to use, and it would work the exact same way for both. There's just a couple more clicks to do in Burp. The difference, I think, though, is that fuzzer in ZAP, while it does do the same thing, it sounds like you're fuzzing the application looking for 0 days. When in actuality, in reality, you're just making a bunch of requests against the same site, looking for different responses and modifying some kind of data in that response and request sequence one after the other, which is exactly what Intruder does. So ZAP may not have something called Intruder, but the fuzzer really does give you similar capability. You just have to have a little bit more control about what you're setting. So for instance, some of the mangling that's in ZERP and some Burp and some of the username generators are pretty fantastic. In ZAP, you may not have those. You might have to build your own file to use as your username file, whereas Burp may automate some of those pieces for you directly.
Hey, Matt, I want to chime in here. One of the things I like in Intruder that I found very, very useful is to sort by request. Once you're starting the attack, you can sort by request and watch them as they go through, but then you can actually do a second column sort by status or length, or even a field that you've grepped on, and you can see whether you get success based on the secondary sort. So it's actually kind of interesting to watch the progress.
Yeah, and just so everyone can see that, Joff, the field you're talking about is, let's see. Let's do
right there in the attack logs window is what I was referring to, yep.
Oh, that's right. I don't have this activated, so I can't modify it. This field right here, where it says intruder attack log. Let's see, I can do a magnifier, I think. Yeah, so this field right here, where you can sort by different columns and tables and such. Is that right, Joff?
Yep, exactly. And I particularly like, request is great because I like to reverse sort it and see the most recent request. But then you can get a secondary sort by clicking on one of the other columns as well. So it's actually useful to see whether you've succeeded. Maybe it's the HTTP status that changes if you've succeeded. It depends on how you've enumerated the successful result versus not successful as you're doing your reconnaissance.
Another nice part about this window here, the intruder attack window, it pops out separate from Burp, so you've got it on its own, which I also find to be pretty handy. What I like to do to determine success statuses, for instance, all of these status 200s, they may be status 200s if it's a successful login or a failed login. So you can't always judge just based on that, though sometimes you can. What I like to use as a success status indicator is the size of the response.
Yep.
So, for instance, if you go to the far right-hand side of this pane, it's cut off in this window, but there's actually one that will tell you how many bytes were in the response. And thing is, if you're guessing a lot of bad passwords, the password response, where it tells you, oh, this is a bad password, login failed, is probably the same size as all of the other guesses you've had, give or take the 3 characters in length difference between guesses. So if you just order by length and look for things that have a completely different length, normally those are either completely failed or bad responses, something went wrong. Sometimes you can accidentally stumble upon SQL injection that way, or they're successful responses where it straight up logged you in, and so the size of the web page on the inside is much different than the outside.
Very cool.
So now I just have to find out how to get my magnifier to go away. There we go. Okay. Awesome. And the same is exactly true of password guessing. So here, nothing's changed. Burp and ZAP, password guessing versus user enumeration, just separate fields. And with user enumeration, you actually have to find a condition where it works, because that shouldn't happen. Talking to you, WordPress. Okay, so here we're going after bad session management. In this case, bad session management is another thing that we see very commonly on web applications. I think it's the number 3 in the OWASP top 10. Is that right? Don't quote me on that. It's like number 2 or 3.
I think it's
bad
on the new one. They've shifted things around. So.
And here's a great example of that. Session management is entirely about what the UID is and what the handle is. And so if you change your UID to 2, then it comes back with Trinity as opposed to Neo, because Trinity's user identification ID is 2. So you may have some web applications that actually check appropriately to see what your password is. So you log in, the password gets hashed, it gets checked against what the password is in the database. It's good, awesome, you're logged in. Welcome Neo UID 0. Now after authentication, after login, if you change your UID to 1 or 2, it should also validate that you're still Neo, and should probably have some kind of session tracking token, like a session ID, to do that. In this case, nothing like that is there. It's just got a straight UID, and if we change that, we also change the user that we are logged in as. With a intercepting proxy, it's very easy to do that. So here on the right-hand side, we've got that in Burp in one step, you just browse to the page. Now that we're on the page, we're logged in as Neo. We hit intercept, intercepting goes on, refresh the page, and then now we can change the UID and the handle to change it to whatever we would like to be. Here we change the handle to Trinity, and it says Welcome Trinity. What we saw earlier when we did the real quick console window in Firefox, I changed the handle to John Strand, and so it said Welcome John Strand, because that's all the web application does. It doesn't do any real checking behind the scenes.
So I got a question for you, Matt. On Burp, you have the capability, I believe it's under Engagement Tools, where it'll actually show you all the different input parameters and what pages those input parameters exist. Is there anything comparable in ZAP Proxy, which will map out the input parameters and the pages that these particular parameters exist?
And holistically site-wise, you're asking, right?
Yep, holistic, across the entire site, exactly.
Yeah, there may be. I've not seen that. I would hate to say that ZAP doesn't do it.
Because somebody has already written a plugin, I'm sure, right? Like, oh, it's on my Git repository. But this kind of, like this last thing that you're talking about is also key, because a lot of the really good web application pen testers that I know, they basically get to the point where they just start tampering with any type of input field. I mean, if you have a UID equals something, that's pretty obvious, but sometimes they don't have obvious names. And you'll find people that do amazing things, like I think Bo did some interception of credit card transactions with the Fantasy Football League website a while ago. And I asked, how the hell did you actually think of doing this? He was like, I just started messing around with fields. And, you know, just going through and just tampering everything you can is always a good play.
Yep, absolutely. Luke Baggett did something very similar over the summer. It was a really, really good job. I would never have thought to look there, but if you just keep looking everywhere, things fall out.
Eventually you find something weird. And that's why the ability to map out all of the input parameters in Burp is so powerful, because you can see there's this particular variable and it shows up in half the website. Well, that might be kind of important. Or also the inverse is true. It only shows up in one place on the admin page. Well, that might be important as well. So it gives you an idea, like if you're starting to mess with a variable, identifying where that variable actually exists in the website is actually really helpful.
And when it comes to messing with those variables, the intruder or in ZAP the fuzzer are great tools to do just arbitrary guessing and enumeration with them, especially when they're shorter fields.
Yeah.
And ZAP and Burp can both do those.
Cool deal.
Okay. So that's on the very bottom side. You can see there changing the same fields with ZAP. You just set a breakpoint, it intercepts a breakpoint. Now we can change the cookie field to whatever it is we'd like to. We can also change that from the browser directly if you've got it in the browser and you want to session hijack that way. Okay.
I think that's it.
That brings us 2 minutes to the end, and at the end of the presentation, so perfect.
We had questions rolling in the middle of it, so
Nice.
I suppose we should probably wrap it up unless we have a few end questions, Sierra.
We do have a end question that's, I think, pretty good. So this is for the whole team, if you guys have input. What are your favorite recommendations for Burp plugins? There are quite a few available, but which ones have proven most valuable on engagements?
Download them all. I don't know. And this is one of those things. I think that most of the people at BHIS, we use Burp almost exclusively. And I think a lot of times whenever we're pulling down Burp plugins, a lot of times it's in situations that Joff was talking about for some weird languages, like if you're working with something like Angular 2, which is a pain in the ass, or if you're dealing with some strange encoding that's being used that Burp just can't understand. That's usually where we end up finding different plugins and then pulling them in. Are there any plugins that you guys like to use?
I'd just like to chime in on a couple there. John's, first of all, absolutely right. It tends to be context specific. A number that I particularly like, though, are some of the beautifier plugins. JavaScript beautifier, for example, is very, very useful if you're trying to search through some JavaScript and you need it to sort of be de-obfuscated and beautified so it's more readable. That kind of thing I find very useful. Also the Java deserialization scanner stuff in the case of Java serialization vulnerabilities, which are particularly pernicious vulnerability that tends to exist around the place. But again, that's very context specific. CSRF token scanners can be useful. There's a number of them. I don't particularly have any favorite. It's sort of a matter of choosing the right tool for the right job at the right time.
Hey, sorry to cut everybody off. If you have to leave now, the winner of the shirt is Brandon Tharp. So if you email me, Brandon Tharp, Sierra@bhis.co, with your size and your address, I'll send it out to you.
Yay, Brandon.
Yay. Okay. We didn't get around
I
to
some.
all of them, but we do some like party poppers
Yeah,
and some
poppers,
confetti.
isn't it?
Hey guys, I gotta jump off.
Michael
See you,
says,
Bo.
Jump off. I'll see you guys later.
bye bye.
Hey.
And you get 10 Brandons responding. Okay, yeah, we did record it, and we will have the slides along with the recording when we post it, probably on Monday, I think. I'm looking at
Brianna's
Brady.
like, no more videos, no more editing.
Our next webinar will be in the new year, I think.
Is that the the threat hunting one? The the first one?
We
Kate,
can't do
2018?
threat hunting unless you want to do sacred cash cow tipping.
It might be time.
I think it's
But that
we do
one-
that every
That's getting to the
January.
point where bypassing blacklisted AV is not that
It's
interesting.
boring because we can just do it.
Yeah, well. But no, we're going to come up with some more defensive ones, some more offensive ones. 2018 is going to be kind of insane for webcasts because Sierra's gone a little overboard. But that's fine. That's what she's here for. All right. Thank you very much for attending, everybody, and we'll see you at the next webcast.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.